As I said, this sermon has 3 parts, and so it's one of those things where we could either agree we'll just stay here for an hour and a half today, and I'll just get from beginning to end, or we'll divide it up into 3 parts, and which we're going to do the latter. So if it feels like we're leaving things kind of in a unresolved spot today, as you go home, that's okay. We'll try to move it ahead further next Sunday, and then move it a little bit further as we go through the third Sunday. We're talking about a huge topic. There's so many different directions to go with it today. But what I'm really wanting to do is get into the root of sexual identity and where is God in the midst of that. So we're going to try to look at that today. I know there's going to be questions and comments and discussions that could come up out of this, and we might get there in these 3 weeks. We might not. If I can be of any help or continue the questions and discussions, I'd be glad to do so. I really wish this was a sermon series I didn't have to preach about. This is not a fun topic, and I probably spent more time research preparing for this way more than I would on a typical sermon, because there's so many facets. It's a huge topic, and there's so many ins and outs to it. I really wish we lived in a world where everybody's just okay, and everything just works beautifully, and everybody gets along, and it's wonderful. But we don't live in that kind of world. Sexual identity is a very debatable issue. It's a controversial issue. It's one that we have to struggle over. But it's not really just an issue. It's people. We're dealing with people. People, many of us already know this issue firsthand. It's in our family, amongst our friends, people we work with, go to school with. Even maybe within ourselves, we've had our struggles with this issue. It comes close, and as soon as this issue has a name of somebody that we love, it becomes very personal. And I know for some of us here today, and I don't know totally, but for some here, I'm sure in a crowd this size, it's a very personal issue. And so with as much sensitivity, we need to come into this. We're not just debating a topic that we love to debate because it's part of our national conversation. We're discussing something that has faces and names and has love attached to it. And so I want us to realize we're not talking about something happening out in California. We're not talking about something that just happens in some random situation or person we know, but real people that we're close to and we care for and we want the best for. And probably along the way, each of us here has come here today with our own opinion about sexual identity. You know, there's many different facets to it, and we've kind of probably come to our conclusions about what we think about it today. I don't know if the sermon is supposed to change the way we think, but just to give perspective to the ways that we think. And hopefully we'll be able to do that as well. And hopefully that we can have intelligent and loving conversations on this topic, and it doesn't have to be a debatable thing where people are angry and judging and hurting each other. We don't want anything to ever come to that, especially as we are as Christians in the body of Christ. So it's a very emotionally charged topic. I'm just really believe, though, that God gives us some direction. I can't say that I can understand it totally, and I don't have my own questions and trying to figure things out, but at least we'll try to shine some light on this. And especially as we talk about sexual identity, we talk about 2 forms of that that we deal with in our conversations. And one is homosexuality, the other is transgender. And the transgender thing, I mean, that's a relatively new thing that people talk about now, and it's on the talk shows and it's in the news, and it is a hot topic as we deal with policies and beliefs and things like that. First I want to say that, these 2 things are often labeled deviations because they're not the norm. But just to put us all on an equal playing field, all of us have been deviants when it comes to our sexual identity and our understanding of where sexuality plays into our lives. We've all, somewhere along the way, broken the commandment to be able to stay pure, to be able to not use our bodies in a way that would dishonor God. Somewhere along the way, I'm pretty sure that all of us have had desires that weren't God's desires. We've possibly had attitudes and behaviors that weren't God's attitudes and behaviors as well. And so we come here not talking about them out there and pointing our finger in disgust or shame. All of us, every single person who's created, has sexually gone from God's path in one way or another along the way. And so we're all on equal playing field here. We're not signaling out any necessarily group of people, but really focusing on how do we handle these deviations, the things that are different than the norm. And we will focus on that just in that light. Our sexuality is a gift from God. It was a gift that was passed on to us from the generation before, but it was already broken when we got it. And therefore, we take our broken sexuality and we live with it in our lives, and sometimes it hurts ourselves, sometimes it hurts other people. We don't always mean to hurt people with it, but we're broken in every area of life, including in our sexuality as well. We have not treated it with the honor and the holiness that God intended it for it to be treated with, and therefore we've all transgressed and used his gift of sexuality in the wrong ways. Homosexuality is an attraction to the same sex. Transgender is the feeling that who I am as a gender, the way I think, is different than the gender of the sexuality of my body that was given to me. So it's like feeling like you're a woman trapped in a male's body, or a man trapped in a woman's body. And that's what we're talking about with transgender. And there's so many different variations along the way. We're not getting into all the details of where it goes, but just as a general category. And I'm not going to go through every verse of the Bible that says something about these topics. There are a few verses that are in there, and I've listed those in there if you want to look at just in general what the Bible does say about homosexuality, what it does say about sexuality in general. You can do that on your own. But I want to go beyond what the Bible says to let's look at the roots of the issue in the first place. And to begin with, I said, let's just stop and take a look at Jesus, because I think he gives us some perspective as we think about his path in his faith led him through obedience to God, but it resulted in joy. In Hebrews 12:2, we read that we look to Jesus, who was the founder and perfecter of our faith, and who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. Why was Jesus able to endure the suffering? Why was he able to be obedient to the will of the Father and go through all that? Because there was joy waiting him on the other side. I doubt there was much joy when the soldiers were hammering the nails. I doubt that's the emotion he felt. But deep down inside, he knew that something better was coming, that there was joy in having accomplished the obedience to the will of God. And so he was able to do that. And then we read in the next verses, consider him, Jesus, who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Whenever we feel temptation to sin, sometimes it feels like it's killing us. We feel like it's really a heavy thing, and we feel like there's no way out. Jesus himself had the temptation to sin, but he didn't sin. He found the way out by being obedient to the will of God. He knows what it's like to struggle with sin. I mean, even in the garden, before he went to the cross, he was so intensely in touch with what was going to happen that he sweat drops of blood. Drops of blood that shows us how internally he was struggling with it. And he came to the conclusion, he said, Father, I don't want to do this, but if it's your will, then I will do it. You know, he had to cross a line that was difficult to do. And we have to cross lines when we face temptations to sin as well. Are we going to struggle and even sweat the drops of blood that are needed to be able to be obedient and to live the life of faith? Or do we give up and give in? When we struggle to do what's right, it doesn't kill us. It feels like it's going to kill us. But for Jesus, it did kill him. To do what was right did lead him to death. And probably in our struggle against sin, we're not going to die over it. Even if we say no and refuse the temptation, it's not going to kill us. God's word gives us the encouragement. Jesus said, hey, here's the example. When we're feeling like we're struggling with temptations, look to him, because he's gone there, he's been there. He didn't maybe think and feel every scope of things that we feel, but he knows what it's like to have temptations, and he knows what it's like to have victory over it. And so to the person who's dealing with sexual identity, in other words, having same attractions or feeling like they're trapped in the wrong body, or the person that's tempted with pornography, for the person who's tempted to flirt with somebody that's not their spouse, with the person who's tempted to get into a relationship with somebody, either before marriage or after marriage, that has a sexual aspect to it, whether it's having sexual tensions, dysfunctions within our marriages, whether it's having, no matter what it is, whatever we're struggling with, these things aren't going to kill us. They're not going to send us to having to shed our blood and to give up our life. And God is saying, be obedient. Work through these things. Let me show you how to be obedient to the will of the Father, to be holy and righteous in the midst of these temptations. Obedience is not a rock that drowns us, but obedience is a path. It's a path that leads to joy. And while the choice of disobedience seems natural, that setting is taking us on a broken and bumpy road. And when we have the choice before us, in any area of life, but speaking specifically of sexual temptations, as we deal with those, we have a choice. Take the path that Jesus would have us go on with him, that would be a path that leads to joy, or to take on a path that feels joy at the moment, feels like the right thing, but doesn't lead to the real joy that follows it. Those are what we have to deal with, and we have to deny our fleshly temptations, even though that's not fun to do. It's not easy to do, but God has said, I want to teach you how to be able to make those decisions, to be obedient, and not let it be a heavy rock, but something that gives you joy. In Genesis chapter 2, when Adam and Eve were tempted, it wasn't just about whether they should take the fruit or not take the fruit. There was more to it than that. In fact, the temptation was, do they worship God or not worship God, and worship the created thing? In other words, themselves. Because God had said, here's the path of obedience. Do this, don't do that. And they had to choose, am I going to worship God by listening to what he says and honoring his word? Or what Satan came along in the snake and said, hey, why do you need to listen to him? Do what you want to do. You can become like God. You'll know everything that God knows. And immediately then, they took their eyes off of worshiping God and began to worship themselves, the created thing, thinking, wow, I could be something better than I am. I could be equal to God, maybe better than God. And they took that temptation. And it wasn't, like I said, take the fruit or not. It was worship God or worship the created thing. That was themselves. And they chose to worship themselves in that moment because they wanted to make themselves God, to make themselves the center of everything. And ever since then, every temptation that we face is really that choice. Do we worship God or do we worship the created thing? Whatever it is that God made out there, or even just worshiping ourselves and our own choices. We live in a world that says we've arrived. We've been perfecting the body. We can make it stay healthy and young-like and beautiful much longer than generations in the past have done it. So there's nothing wrong with that, but it comes with a bit of worship in the midst of it as we're worshiping our bodies. We're also perfecting the mind. The collective knowledge of the world keeps growing and growing. And even if I don't know it in my own mind, I know how to use Google and Wikipedia, so it's all right there. You know, my mind is in here, right? So we're able to perfect our mind. We know so many things. We're perfecting our inner selves. We have so much self-help available in order to learn how to not let others push us around and how to stand up for ourselves, how to express ourselves, communicate, how to be comfortable being ourselves and working on the inner beauty that's inside of us. Nothing wrong with those things, but that can take on a form of worship. We're trying to elevate ourselves as the created thing. We've been perfecting our new social order. We're learning how to tolerate and how to put aside judgments and create a world where everybody's accepted, everybody's valuable, no one needs to change a thing, people can live as they want, let's just have harmony and peace. And some of those things sound like good things, but it becomes a worship of humanity, a worship of the created thing. And all of these things that we're talking about is what philosophy calls humanism. Humanism is a belief in humanity. It's saying, humanity, we will find the answer to life's problems. And there is some truth in humanism. It's not all bad, but they leave God out of it. We can do it ourselves. We don't need God to fix things or to tell us what to do, and we can figure it out ourselves. We'll make the world a better place. And humanism says we don't need God. We will determine our own purpose and our destiny for ourselves. And that is taking our eyes off of worshiping the Creator and worshiping the created thing, mankind. We worship ourselves and our collective ability to progress and be who we feel like we want to be, not who God created us to be. And this spirit of humanism infects so many things in our culture. It's all around us in many different ways. But as Christians, we are taught to think differently. We believe that God has given his grace to mankind as a gift, who in turn will take the energies of God's grace and will transform our lives to make us better people, and to be able to take the love and service that God gave us and make the world a better place, because God has initiated that in and through us and allows us to be able to have a theistic point of view on things. And this is called theism. We believe the world will be a better place as Christians are being obedient to what God has called us to do. Not because it's in and of ourselves to figure it out, but because God has put it in us. And that is theism. And probably, because you're here today, you probably believe in theism. You believe what I said about that God comes in and works in and through us so that he can receive glory. And that's why we're here today. But in one area of life, humanism has taken a huge stronghold, even in the presence of the church and amongst Christians. Even those that hold a theistic view about everything, when it comes to sexuality, we put that in a different category and we go to a humanistic point of view. Satan the deceiver has masked the truth about sexuality, and he's infused it with this humanism. So that when it comes to everything in life, it's very easy to say God, 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 God. But when it comes to sexuality, we're like, God, stay out of it. Stay out of it. Keep your hands off. Humanism says, I myself own my own sexuality, and I can do with it what I want and what feels right to me. It's not anybody else's business. It's not my parents' business. It's not my friend's business. It's not society's business. It's not the church's business. It's not even God's business. That is what we hear in the culture of sexuality, and that's a humanistic point of view. And many Christians have bought into that point of view. Maybe everything else in life, it's God, God, God. But when it comes to sexuality, we've said this isn't a category by itself, and we've embraced a humanistic view of sexuality. Humanism says sexuality is your personal choice. Be who you're born to be. Express yourself however makes you feel comfortable. But when we get it wrong in that area, when we leave God out of sexuality, it seeps into other areas of our faith as well and brings it down to where it's not what God wants it to be. Last summer, we had the big debate that came up about what kind of restrooms people are supposed to use. And what we decide about that issue depends on, do we have a theistic view of sexuality or a humanistic view of sexuality? A couple of years ago, when Bruce Jenner changed over to Caitlyn Jenner, what we think about that depends on if we have a theistic view of sexuality or a humanistic view of sexuality. The Supreme Court passed the marriage equality law, allowing same-sex marriages. And what we think about that depends on if we have a theistic view of sexuality or a humanistic view of sexuality. If you hold to a humanistic view of sexuality, then pretty much everything I say from here on out, you're going to say, I don't I don't grab it. Okay? I'm not saying you should tune out. I'm not saying we should argue about it. But I'm going to be, at the rest of today and the next 2 weeks, talking about the theistic view of sexuality and what are the ramifications of that. But if you're standing here today saying, I grab the humanistic view of sexuality, then we're gonna struggle a little bit more. If you do have a theistic view of sexuality, then grab onto these things to strengthen our faith so that we understand God's view of sexuality even more. Like I say, I'm not out to argue with anybody. I'm just trying to point out what God has revealed to us, even though it goes countercultural with the humanistic view of sexuality. Within Christianity, there are some people that are so heavy on truth that they leave out the love. And they become militantly angry and look at people who think differently as their enemies. And Jesus has no connection with that at all. There are some people in Christianity that say, oh, let's just focus on the love part and leave the truth out of it, and we just embrace and embrace and embrace, and we never call people to a higher standard. People who say that they have a theistic view of everything in life, we tend to get soft on. And that's not what it's about either. Militant truth is dangerous. Permissive love is dangerous as well. And God doesn't support either, and both of those groups have given Christians a bad name in our society. Neither of these extremes reflect the nature of God, and He's shown us how to do it equally well. If we hold on to truth, it doesn't mean we have to throw out love. And if we hold on to love, it doesn't mean we have to throw out truth. We can hold on to truth generously and love generously at the same time. And Jesus, as we're going to see, gave us an example of that. There was a day when a prostitute was brought to Jesus by the religious leaders who were ready to stone her for her sin. And according to truth, she had sinned and deserved that very punishment. They were right. But Jesus challenged them, and He said, what? Whoever of you is without sin, you cast the first stone. Well, those religious people, realizing that they were not sinless either, put down their stones on the ground and walked away. They realized that they couldn't support what Jesus had said and walked away. But Jesus, He was sinless. He could have picked up that rock, and He had every right to have thrown that rock at that prostitute. I mean, it was Jesus Himself who made the law. He's the one that gave it to Moses. It said, if somebody's sinning sexually, committing adultery, they deserve to be killed. I mean, Jesus made that up Himself. And He was sinless, and He could have thrown that stone right at her. He was the only one that had the right to do so. But did He throw it at her? No. What did He do instead? He threw a different kind of stone. It was a stone of love. He reached out to her and told her, I'm not going to condemn you either. He could have clobbered her with the truth and said, you're a sinner, you've disgraced God, you've disgraced the people you've slept with, you've disgraced yourself. But He said, no, I don't condemn you either. He could have had a really wishy-washy, permissive kind of love and said, oh, you poor girl, I knew you grew up in some really bad situations and you ended up on the street and you're supporting yourself this way. And yeah, maybe it's not what every mother dreams for her little girl, but go out and do it. That's fine. You're earning a living and you're making these guys happy, and just be careful out there. He didn't respond that way as well. He said what? Go and sin no more. He called it sin. Because what you're doing is wrong. So He brought truth and love together in a perfect way. He who had the right to cast the stone said, no, instead of throwing the stone of judgment, I'm going to throw the stone of grace. And I'm going to embrace you in your sin, but also say, let's just leave that sin alone. Let's just drop that right then and there. I have something better for you. Truth without love would have left her dead. Love without truth would have sent her right back to where she was before. And Jesus comes along again and says, neither will I condemn you. Go and sin no more. One of the passages that does speak about homosexuality, in fact, is everything in the Bible that does talk about homosexuality does so in a negative light. And there are people who kind of twist it around and say, well, it really means this and that. But if you take the Bible for what it says, it's in a negative light. And one of the passages that talks about homosexuality talks about it, but along with lots of other sins in Romans chapter 1. And a little summary of it says here, for what can be known about God is plain to them, talking about people, because God has shown it to them. But they did not know God, and they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, and their foolish hearts were darkened, claiming to be wise, exchanging the glory of God for images resembling mortal man, exchanging the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. This talks about that humanistic point of view. When we get our worship off of God, when we get the truth of God and put it to the side, then we become worshiping the created thing. We can figure it out for ourselves. We'll make our own rules. We'll live by our own decisions. They don't want God, they just want his stuff. Oh, we love what you made. Oh, wow, when God made humans, when Adam and Eve, he said, this is very good. We were very good, but they've taken it to where, thanks God, you made us, but we'll take over from here. We are really good, aren't we? Isn't it amazing what we can do with our bodies and our minds and our souls, all without God? And the last part of Romans 1 gives an example of many different sins that happens when people go to a humanistic view. One of those is a distortion of sexuality, but there are lots of other things as well, like being envious, by gossiping, slandering other people, boasting, being heartless, disobedient to parents, foolishness. There's a whole bunch of things on there that pretty much summarize those that leave God out of the view. And back in the days of Adam and Eve, when they did sin, it brought a curse upon themselves that's passed on to every generation since. And the world got broken. People got broken. The world is broken. Why do we have tornadoes and earthquakes and all this stuff? Because it's broken. The world is under a curse, and it hurts us. Weeds grow. Apples rot. Mosquitoes and rattlesnakes and bears try to bite us. They're dangerous animals out there. And just as the world gets broken, people are broken. Some embryos don't develop right. Some die. Babies are born with defects. We get viruses, infections, we get broken bones and diseases. And just when we reach our prime, what happens? Our body starts going downhill. Our memory starts going downhill. The problems mount. Just when we think we've got it all together, we see how the curse has affected us in many ways. And it's also affected our morality as well. Our morality is broken. And it keeps us from doing what's right, and it leads us to do what is wrong. And we're made in God's image. Adam and Eve were made in his image to glorify him. And anytime we do something that's not in God's image, then that would be sin. We're breaking God's order and purpose for ourselves. And that's the thing, that sin means that I was born that way, with a broken sin nature. It doesn't make it right. What it means is that we no longer give God the reflection of who he's created us in his image to be, because of that brokenness that's inside of us. Our spiritual blueprints are tarnished from day one. Circumstances come along in our lives that tarnish us even more. We just don't have a whole lot to say about how our bodies and our souls are going to turn out. When we're in the womb, nobody asked us what we wanted in life. We didn't get to pick how tall we would be, what color hair, eyes we'd have. We didn't get to pick who our parents would be, who our siblings would be. We didn't get to pick most of those things, did we? It happened for us. And just in the same way, our sexuality wasn't always, we weren't given a choice in that as well. There's hardly a teenager who struggled with sexual identity that didn't have a prayer that said, God, make me normal, change me, help me to be like everybody else. I don't want to be one of those people that everybody makes fun of. And unfortunately, that becomes an unanswered prayer almost all the time in that young person's life, as they're grappling with that sexual identity and they're saying, God, can't you do something about that? You made me in your image, but something's not quite connecting here. So God, do something about it. Fix it. And it doesn't really happen that God will fix those things. It's the unanswered prayer. And, we have to have a little more compassion than what we normally do for people who have had unanswered prayers. Probably, 4% of the population struggle with same-sex attractions, and maybe 0.3% of the population struggle with the transgender issue. I mean, there's lots of different statistics. I think I've tried to find the most common ones then. What about those people? What about the 4% and the 0.3%? That's not fair. If they were born broken, it's just, why would God hold that against them? Those are some of the questions we need to grapple with. It's painful, it's confusing, it's dangerous. It can even be suicidal in many people's cases as they're struggling with this. And to many, death may seem like the best option, because living with a sexual deviation can be a very hard life to live. If my family says it's not normal, if my society says it's not normal, if God says it's not normal, then what do I do with myself? Those are the questions that people with sexual identity issues have to struggle with, and it can take years and years and even not ever get really resolved. So it's much easier to just say, well, I'm going to embrace a humanistic view of sexuality. I mean, if my family's not for it and my society's not for it and God's not for it, well then forget it. A theistic view of sexuality just doesn't line up. So therefore, it's very easy temptation to throw that out and grab a humanistic view that says, I'll just decide for myself then. I'll make my own rules. And that's why it's so easy for a lot of people to switch over to that. But a theistic view says, I don't condemn you. Go and sin no more. Two very different approaches. Maybe it sounds simplistic, and like I say, we're going to be ending it at this point and moving on to the next steps in the next couple weeks. If there's disagreement or confusion or something I've said today, don't walk away mad, don't start gossiping, we can talk it through if we need to. These are tough issues, and I'm struggling with it myself, trying to figure it all out. One sin is not worse than the other. No sin deserves more punishment than another one. We're all needing God's mercy. As I said at the beginning, we have all sexually deviated from God. So to put ourselves in categories and put labels on us, it's ridiculous. We're all the same here. God's given his grace and mercy to sinners, and he's asked us to do that as well, to pass out God's grace and mercy. We're going to do something a little different today. As you see, the communion stuff's up here, and you maybe read about it in your bulletin, but as a symbol of saying that we agree we're all on the same level and we're not going to judge people or hate people or put them on a different level, lower, or put ourselves higher than other people, taking communion by coming forward and taking it kind of is a symbol of being able to say we all need to come to Jesus. We all need to come to him, and we've done that in our lives, and today is just a way to humbly be able to say, I realize there's room at the cross for all of us, no matter what our sexual identity is, what we've done, what we haven't done, who we are, who we think we're going to be in the future. God has said, come to us in the face of Jesus and said, I do not condemn you, but go and sin no more. And we come on that basis alone. We're going to sing a song before we do this. Excuse me.